And all new 5, a major organized crime bust. 23 people under arrest now, accused of stealing guns and cash.
Today, police revealed 4 organized crime groups are wreaking havoc.
From aggravated robbery to kidnapping, burglary, and more. Let's take a look at this. New pictures from court documents in this case. These are a few of the people who have been charged. And investigators say the money, tens of thousands of dollars, is all stolen.
FBI, open up! Welcome to this episode of Chatting with Stacks. I'm your host, Bill Stacks, and today I got Chris Carroll.
He had that look about him, and here we are laying in the middle of the street, and I could tell he was in bad shape, and he's kind of, not to get too graphic, but he's having a hard time breathing.
So he's trying to breathe. He's trying to breathe.
Yeah, he's trying to breathe. He's trying to breathe, and it sounds like somebody trying to breathe like through a bowl full of water. He's in bad shape. So he's looking at Suge Knight. Suge's still yelling at him, and I'm pointing my gun at Suge, telling him to get back. Well, I finally looked at Tupac, and realizing his situation. We have something in law enforcement called a dying declaration, and what that is basically if somebody's in the process of dying, if they can tell you who did it, that's admissible in court. It's not hearsay. Normally, it'd be hearsay, but under this dying declaration rule, if they tell you, that's all good. So I looked at him and I said, "Hey man, who shot you?" He's, most people who are murdered know who their murderer is. And I'm like, "Who shot you, man? Who did this? What happened?" And he's just kind of like ignoring me. He's not even looking at my face. He's looking over at Suge. And I'm just like, hey, I'm getting his attention. "Who shot you?" And right up, I looked at Suge about then. For the first time I looked, there's another cop, and he's literally got his hands in Suge's chest, and he's pushing him back away from me. So I'm like, okay, thank God I'm not here alone. Yeah. So I could look at Tupac a little bit better. And I look at him and I'm like, "Hey, who shot you?" And he finally looked at me, locked eyes with me. And right about then he kind of just went, quiet and peaceful, because he was like before he was kind of like wiggling, trying to yell back at Suge. And he's just kind of like, nope. Just realized like he physically couldn't do it anymore. And he just you could tell he was just like, "I'm done." And he just kind of went back and he went peaceful and was no longer squirming or fighting or anything like that. And, I looked at him again and said, "Who shot you?" And he looked in my eyes, and I could tell him he was starting to get a breath together. And I was like, "Oh, he's going to lay the info on me." And he gets his breath together and he looks at me, he looked in my face and he went, "F you." And and after he said it, his eyes rolled back and he just coughed up some blood and he went unconscious. So those would be the last thing that he ever said in his life. So he basically lost consciousness at that moment. The ambulance showed up and there's some discussion about this. I'd say about 4 minutes till the ambulance show up. So relatively quick, given the situation. So when they get there, they intubate him right away. They're sticking tubes right down his mouth. They put him in the ambulance. One of the things I didn't mention about Suge is he's shot in the side of the head. And while he's running around and he's yelling and doing all this, blood is flying out of the side of his head. He's acting like he's fine. He's not even acknowledging that he's been shot. So what had happened is the bullet had penetrated his scalp, but not his skull. So it never went into his head. It just, hit his
vein
or
something, right?
And those head wounds, and it was a good wound, but those head wounds bleed a lot. So he's just bleeding all over the place. So he needs to go to the hospital too. So both of those guys got in the ambulance. I grabbed one of the guys who worked for me, and he grabbed another cop, and those 2 cops jumped in the ambulance with them. And those guys wrote, and I said, "Look, in case somebody talks, be ready for that." Plus, we needed cops in the ambulance because Suge is still being an idiot, and he needs to be kept under control in an ambulance. And so they all went to the hospital together. And when I never went to the hospital, I was staying back there at the scene. But basically, that was, for all purposes, that was the end of Tupac. They got him into a high-level trauma center, and they went right into emergency surgery, and they kept his heart beating. But he was done. There was nothing anybody could have done. Later on they said he could have been shot in the in front of the doorway of the hospital. It wouldn't have helped him. And now I had some new information that because it came out of at the grand jury hearing, they had one of the doctors there testify that he had 2 liters of blood in his chest and lungs, where they shouldn't have been. So that's a lot of blood. So even the fact that he was still technically alive when he got to the hospital is kind of a miracle within itself. But that would be it for him. And then his mother had him removed from life support several days later.
Yeah.
So
I think it was 7 days. 7 days later.
7 days. It's crazy that they kept his heart going that long. But it's a good trauma center. So they did what they could. Back at the scene, I'm still there with all of those guys in the entourage pretty much for the whole night. By then, at that time, I want to say it was around 11 p.m. And, like I said, we would head into the station at like 12:30, and I'm like, oh, not tonight. No one's going anywhere for, quite a while. So we were out there, and, ultimately, what we called ID, CIS shows up, and detectives show up. I mean, that all takes a long time. I mean, like the video that you're seeing, like the yellow tape is up and stuff. So that's a considerable amount of time after things had happened. One thing that a lot of younger people don't understand because they grew up in a different time is they're like, why aren't there a million pictures and videos and everything? So this is all before cell phone cams. There are no cell phone cams. Some of the pictures at the crime scene, I'm even surprised that they got those because these are just people walking by with film cameras taking pics. And, you can find some of those pics on the internet. Sometimes you got to dig a little bit, but they're out there. Now, there's no pics with Tupac still there. No one was that quick.
Well, there's one picture with Tupac right before he got killed. This woman took a picture of him in the car, right here. Yes,
there you go, right there. And that's just from a fan. But one of the things that happened, maybe it's not important, an hour or two before the shooting is, and I had heard this before, but I hadn't talked to the cop. But now I had found the cop. They were stopped for playing their stereo too loud, like an hour or two before this shooting, because they were out driving the strip. That's something we wouldn't usually write a ticket for it unless there was some kind of problem. That's the kind of thing you usually pull somebody over, talk to them. If they're okay, you say turn down the stereo, and if they're cooperative, that's usually where it ends. And that's what happened with those guys. They got pulled over by another bike cop who I've since found and talked to, but he asked him to turn down the stereo. They did. He talked to him for a little bit, and they went on their way. And that was an hour or two before Tupac ends up getting killed.
But it was after the fight.
Yes. So you got a decent time span between the fight and the shooting. For definitely more than an hour, maybe even more than 2. So, maybe somewhere in the 2-hour range between the fight and the shooting. So they had been up and down the strip a bit, just, fooling around, driving around, being young guys,
Yeah, they're supposed to go to a nightclub. They're on their
right.
Nightclub, right?
And, everybody knew that the party was at that nightclub that night. So as far as finding them to shoot them up, it wasn't that hard to do because some people were like, how would they know where they are? And it's like, well, there's one main road that you would probably take if you were going to that nightclub, which is where he got shot. So not that hard to find those guys. And, they're also, his car really stood out. It was, it was a high-end BMW, all decked out and, with all the trimmings. Now, and you got to remember, this is 1996. There weren't a lot of like high-end cars rolling around like there are now. Like now they're everywhere. It's like almost not such a big deal anymore. They're everywhere. It wasn't like that then. If you had a car like that, high-end BMW, custom rims, custom this and that, it was a pretty big deal. I mean, it really stood out.
Yeah.
So they weren't that hard to find.
So you're covered in blood at this point, right? After they
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for sure, there's blood on me. I wouldn't say I'm covered in it, but yeah, for sure, there's blood on me. And one of the things about that night is I didn't realize. I don't think anybody realized the magnitude of the situation as it was right then. One of the things people don't usually get is Tupac is actually bigger now than he was then. It's like, yes, he was a famous guy, but now he's reached, he's an icon, and he's as big. He might be the biggest rapper in history. That wasn't the case in '96, so it wasn't as significant a scene. So people ask me, it's like, oh my God, did you save that uniform with the blood on it? And I'm like, no. To tell you the truth, it didn't stand out in my mind and the other people that were there as quite the huge deal that it is now. If going back, things would have been different, as probably in a couple different ways, but no one knew what it was going to be quite the big deal that it was.
Yeah.
And that has turned into it. And, strangely enough, I think it gets bigger every year. You think as time went on, things would fade, but what's happened is exactly the opposite. Every year it gets bigger and bigger. And, this year now we've got the arrest of Keefe D, the thing is just blown up into craziness. And I'll know when there's been some development of the case or something has happened, because all of a sudden the press will start calling me. It'll go cold for a while, and all of a sudden, boom, 10 calls in a day. I'm like, what happened? Something clearly has happened. And, with Keefe D getting arrested, that's probably been the biggest development. But it could be something as small as, and there's so many conspiracy theories out there, and you might want to bring that up later.
Yeah.
But something as insignificant as, like, I'll get 7-8 calls in a day all of a sudden, and I'm like, what happened? It's clearly something happened. And one time, Kamala Harris was doing an interview, and somebody asked her, who's the greatest living rapper? And she said Tupac. And everybody went, see, he is alive. She knows it. She made a mistake. He's alive. And I'm like, all it takes is somebody to say one sentence, one little thing, and the door is open again. It won't close for a while. So, now we got this thing coming up. The trial is scheduled for November. I think the trial will happen. A lot of speculation and people bringing up there's going to be a plea bargain. I hear that all the time. Plea bargain, plea bargain, plea bargain. All I can say is, I've talked to the DA. I've seen the interviews from both the public interviews, both from the DA's office with the police department and from the defense side as well. Doesn't look like a plea bargain to me. I don't hear anybody talking plea bargain. I hear just the opposite. I hear talk of, they're going to follow through with this and they want to get justice, and it doesn't matter how long it's been, we're going to get things done. And I'm like, it doesn't sound like plea bargain talk to me. If something happened, I would be surprised. Now, something that might happen, which has already happened once, is a delay in the case. That happens all the time. So people are like, oh my God, the case got delayed. They all get delayed. It's standard procedure. So, it's scheduled for November. There could be another delay. We'll see how that plays out.
Did any of the guys in the car talk with you?
I talked with all of them, but as far as any pertinent information on the case, nothing. Stonewalled. Nobody saw anything. And like they talked to me. They were even, we even talked on a it was calm, it was conversational, but as far as giving me information, they weren't doing it. And nobody was playing hardball, like, just saying, I don't talk to the cops. It was more like, no, I'd like to help you. I just didn't see what happened. I heard some shots. Yeah. And then, we all just started rolling. So we rolled together, but, I don't have anything. So, and that's kind of what ended up with this, whole thing is all of those guys, nobody saw anything. And I always thought, and I still think, if there's one guy on this planet who knows who the shooter is for sure, it's Suge Knight. But by this time, he has told so many lies and changed his story so many times that I don't think he knows what the truth is anymore. I mean, for a while there, he was coming out with a different story every month. One time he said it was his ex-wife. And I'm like, well, if you're going to put a murder on somebody, might as well go for the ex-wife. I'm like, it's just had reached the point of ridiculous. So he really has no value as a witness for either side really at this point. I don't see him testifying. Plus the fact that he's in prison in California, I don't see. I guess he has spoke to the press, but I don't see anything happening really with him.
What about anyone else in the car? Is anyone else in the car going to be a witness in this case, do you think?
Oh, are you talking about the people in the entourage?
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I think you can't not call them. Even if they're not talking, you got to bring them up to talk to them. And there was, I'll tell you what, almost all of those guys are dead. Matter of fact, I think the only one who is still alive is a guy, a rapper who goes by Idi Amin. And he testified at he grew up with Tupac, and he testified at the grand jury. So I think we'll see him at the trial as well. But I think he's the only one of those guys that's still alive. I did a show where I was interviewed with him on A&E. I don't know if you have to edit out the name or not, but did a show on A&E with him. And that was the first time. It was only a couple of years ago. It was the first time we had met since that incident. And, I told my story in front of him to a guy who was, the commentator on the show. And I fully expected him to say, no, that isn't what happened. This happened. Because, I'm seeing it from the police point of view. He's seeing it from the suspect point of view. And even if we're both telling the truth, it's probably going to come out different. Yeah. So I told my story, and he just listened quietly throughout the whole thing. And when I was done, I told the story pretty much just like I told it to you. Then they looked at him and said, what is your take on that? And he went, yeah, that's pretty much what happened. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, then, I got
a different perspective on how it went
right.
down,
Well, he
right?
was a little bit upset because he got a gun pointed at him and so forth. And, obviously he didn't like that. But I'm like, hey, do you see where I'm coming from? I don't know who's who. Somebody's shooting somebody. We know that. And all, 5 guys hop out of the car after a shooting. I would be neglected not to point and to be an idiot not to have my gun out pointing at all of them. So he didn't like that. And I get it, but it had to be done. But I tell you, I ended up getting along with the guy and talking to him a little bit afterwards. And we didn't really have disagreement on what had happened. Like you said, maybe a little different take on how he feels and I feel on it, but it went pretty well.
So do you think Puffy was involved with this situation?
I personally don't. And here's what I think. I think it's a great story, and everybody wants a great story. And I think the real story is probably the most boring story. And the real story is a guy got his ass kicked real good, so he went and got a gun and came back and got even. It happens all the time. We even, in Vegas and elsewhere in other cities, even a bouncer just kicking some guys out of the club. Well, they didn't like it. They feel they got disrespected, kicked out of the club by a guy who's bigger than them. They can't just beat him up. So they go and get a gun and come back and shoot him. I mean, it happens all the time. It's just how the street works. It's how crime works. The most simple answer is usually the right answer. And I think, unfortunately, that's what happened in this case. I think Orlando Anderson got beat up, and him and his guys went out looking for him to shoot him to even up the score. And, everybody knew Orlando Anderson in L.A. All the cops knew him. Everybody knew he was a shooter. He'd done this before again and again. Everybody on the street knew it. And he was a guy, that did not look he didn't look physically tough. He didn't look fist fight tough. So he was a guy, if you did him wrong, he came back with a gun. That's how he had to pretty much operate. He had no problem doing it. And he did it again and again. And this was nothing new for him. He just hadn't had a murder pinned on him before. It was one of those deals. Everybody on the street knew who did it. But they didn't really have a case to put together on him before it, or maybe some of the guys he shot up were just other gang member, drug dealer thugs, and no one really cared a whole lot anyway, to tell you the truth. And he just walked. He always walked. But it's not a big stretch for him to do something like that. And he's a guy, if you're gonna beat him up like that, jump him and beat him up with 5 guys, you better be ready, because he's probably coming for you when you least expect it.
And do you think Keefe D was in the car? Because he did some interviews and he basically told on himself. Right.
And you know what? I always have to be a little bit careful, because I am still a witness in the trial. But one thing I can say is stuff that everybody knows is already out there, because I'm not dumping any new info. But he has told the story in detail again and again and again of his role in the murder. I mean, how long can you do that and expect everybody to sit by and do absolutely nothing? He wrote a book. Detailing exactly what he did. So now his defense, and we know this because his defense is already publicly saying it, his defense is, don't believe me, I'm a liar. I was lying. And it's like, what kind of person are you when your defense is, don't believe me, I'm a liar? But that's the situation he now finds himself in. So, that will play out. How that plays out in court, we're just going to have to wait and see.